Hey you guys, and welcome to the epistemology introductory video. We are going to very quickly cover why epistemology is important. We'll talk about what it is first. We're going to talk about where knowledge comes from. We're going to talk about what it is. And then we are also going to talk about why what you think knowledge is affects the way that you work philosophically. Now, it's kind of a mouthful, but it will make more sense in a little bit. Okay, epistemology. Generally speaking, epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's the study of how we know things. There's a difference between someone seeing me not quite clean-shaven and saying, oh, I think he's growing out a beard. I'm not sure. He normally shaves all the time, but he's not growing any. It just seems like he's not shaving lately. Maybe he's growing out a beard. So the difference between that and someone seeing me and saying, oh yeah, Professor Vitt is growing out a beard for sure. And I know this because I've asked him, Professor Vitt, why aren't you shaving anymore? Because because I'm growing out a beard, right? The difference between believing something that happens to be true and knowing something is quite great. And the difference there is justification. What are the reasons we have for thinking something? Now, epistemology is very important as a discipline. A couple of reasons why. First, knowledge affects just about everything that we do. In some way or another, it's very fundamental to how we view the world and how we interact with the world. Consider history as an example. There have been lots of crusades, and if we could know something about whether or not particular religious denominations were in fact correct or another one wasn't, then that might help to settle some of the thousands of disputes that exist in the world today as a result of different religious denominations and beliefs. Next up, knowledge is important for things like running the economy. Somebody say hedge fund, right? Think about the latest economic meltdown in 2007, 2008. When you look back now at analysts, they say, gosh, in hindsight, it's so obvious that all of this was going to go wrong. We can see why all these loans were performing well initially. It's because the market was flooding and it was driving up the rates, and so people were taking out loans that would normally never perform. They were only performing because they were borrowing against the property itself. It created a bubble and everything blew up. That's a very simplified version, but the reason that we know things work a certain way is because we can learn about them. We can know them. Think about the end of your life. Are you going to move on into an afterlife? Are you going to move into the light? Are you going to swim toward the light or go toward the light, whatever it is, or not? Is this an experience that we can know anything about? That's a philosophical question, and it relates to something that has to do with every single one of us, right? Another example. This is the ADE 651. It's a bomb detector. The Iraqi government spent $85 million on these. It purports to be a bomb detector. It is not. It is literally nothing. It is a piece of plastic and an antenna. And it works like a dowsing rod is supposed to, which is to say not at all. At least there's no objective evidence that it works at all. When they did an investigation of this bomb detector, they in fact found that there were no parts at all. It had absolutely no function whatsoever. And as a result, many people in Iraq have lost their lives due to car bombs because of the failure of these devices. So knowledge is very important, and how we distinguish belief from knowledge is very important. So once again, it's an example of philosophy not being something that's irrelevant, but to everyday things. It's beneath everyday things. It's holding those things up, right? It's like plumbing. Philosophy is like plumbing. You only notice it when something goes bad, right? When the plumbing goes bad, you notice it. Otherwise, it's just there in the walls. And philosophy is a lot like that. So first question, where does knowledge come from? Well, there are sorts of two answers. The first one is, knowledge comes from experience. And if you think that all knowledge comes from experience, you are an empiricist. So, it comes from your sight, your sound, your sniffing, your feeling, your tasting, all that sort of stuff. And that's 5. The other side of the coin is to think that philosophy comes from your mind, from the exercise of your rational mind, from your brain. So knowledge comes from the mind alone. It affects what you think knowledge is. If you are a rationalist, then you think knowledge just comes from the mind. So things like math, that would be considered knowledge. Now, you can have different forms of rationalism, and the book will talk about this. You can be like Leibniz and think that knowledge is innate, so you're a rationalist, but you don't think of knowledge as being something that you know. Rather, your mind has certain tendencies, and these tendencies are what makes you a rationalist. Rationalists don't say that knowledge only necessarily comes from the mind, but sort of the best knowledge comes from the mind, or what you really consider to be knowledge comes from the mind. Rationalists will allow that you know things about the world, that you may know that this desk is here, or it's 5:32, or whatever the time is. They'll concede that, but true knowledge is stronger than that. So, let's talk about what knowledge is. Knowledge is true, justified, belief. Okay? Let's talk about the first one first, truth. You can't know something that's false. So I cannot know that the earth is flat. I cannot know that, say, the wall behind me is blue, because it's not blue, and so there's no way you could know that. So the first thing about knowledge is it can't be about something that's false. Secondly, justified. Now, I used some bricks here, a little cobblestone pattern, I think in Paris somewhere, to demonstrate that knowledge has to be justified. Remember in the first example we talked about, it's one thing to think, oh, he's growing out a beard, and it's another to know that I'm growing out a beard because someone has stopped and asked me. And so you need to have a foundation for what you know. And so that's why we have the bricks here. And then lastly, belief. You have to actually believe what you know. If you don't believe it, then you can't be said to know it. If someone doesn't believe that, say, I'm a millionaire, then there'd be no way to say that they know it. Actually, it's a bad example because I'm not really a millionaire, so it wouldn't be true, right? If somebody doesn't believe that the sky is blue, then there's no way that they could know it. Okay, now, the next section that we're going to talk about just real briefly here is justification. Now, justification is going to come in two forms. So we're talking about this part right here, which are the bricks. We'll talk about truth next week, and belief we will leave well enough alone. So, first part here, we're talking about the bricks. Foundationalism. Foundationalism is the belief that justifying something requires that all justification come to one point, and that one point is extremely strong. In fact, it's indubitable. You can't doubt it. So, the idea here for foundationalism is exactly like this picture. All of knowledge rests on one little point, and that one point is itself undoubtable. There's no way you can doubt it. And fittingly enough, this is a picture of the Louvre in Paris. And Descartes is French, so I guess it's sort of thematic. But the way to think about it is this. Descartes starts to wonder. He lives in this time of tremendous upheaval. Galileo and all these sorts of figures are coming about, and they're learning all sorts of things about the world. They're learning that the celestial bodies aren't smooth spheres like they always thought, right? That they can see craters and so forth in the moon. And the foundations of science are changing. People are starting to question Aristotelian science, or they have been for a while, and so they're starting to really wonder about how the world works. And Descartes is part of this. And what he wants to do is find a solid foundation for philosophy and for knowledge. And so what he does is he begins to doubt everything in the world. And so he even doubts, am I René Descartes? Sure, maybe you're not, right? Maybe he's just dreaming that he's a butterfly, and all of a sudden he wakes up and he says, "Gosh, I'm actually this little butterfly," and that was a weird dream that I dreamt I was Rene Descartes. This is a very famous case. It's known as dream doubt. And if you've watched the movie Matrix, the whole thing is very similar to Cartesian dream doubt. The idea is at any moment, any one of us could just wake up. And when we wake up, we realize we're not who we think we are right now. Turns out we're somebody else or something else, a bear or a tadpole or a frog or something like that. Okay. So Descartes doubts everything. He doubts, do the physical objects around him exist? No, because it could be that he's just having a dream right now. So he seems like you can doubt anything if you go along these lines, right? You could doubt that this is a cup of coffee, right? You could doubt that because maybe I'm just dreaming that I'm having a cup of coffee. You could doubt that I'm Professor Vitt. Maybe I'm just Donald Trump having a dream. Who knows? But there's one thing that Descartes finds that he thinks you cannot doubt. And that thing is the fact that you exist. And here's how it works. I can wonder about whether this thing exists, or I can wonder about whether the coffee exists. But if I stop and ask myself, do I exist? Really stop and ask yourself that. Do I exist? If you are asking yourself whether or not you exist, obviously you do. Otherwise, who would be doing the thinking? Right? That's an important point. Because I think, I know that I exist. That's what he's saying. It's a very, very famous saying that he has. It's called, I think, therefore I am. So, Descartes takes that one particular phrase, I think, therefore I am, and he attempts to build all of his knowledge off of it. Just like you see here, where I think, therefore I am is right there, and he just constructs everything off of that. Now, ultimately, it doesn't work. For a variety of reasons, but that would take several videos. Instead, let's just move forward to another version of justification. So remember, foundationalism, epitomized by Rene Descartes, holds that all knowledge has to rest on something that is itself justified. If it doesn't, then you don't know it. But modernly, we really don't think that that works at all. Instead, we hold something called coherentism. And what coherentism says is, all of your knowledge doesn't rest on a single point. Instead, your knowledge kind of forms a web. And different parts of this web support other parts. And some parts are stronger than others. And there's a very complex array of information here. And it all sort of holds together rather than one single part supporting all of it like a structure. Stop and think about that. You believe that water boils at 100 degrees. What justifies that belief? I don't know, I've seen people do it in the past, but have you really seen somebody take a bunch of water and boil it and you measured it to make sure that that was right? I mean, instead you're just sort of always told that, you know, you go to school and they teach you in science class that this is what happens, or maybe you hear it somewhere. And you develop these mechanisms that are maybe more reliable than others, and so you can see how water boils at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and so how do I know that? Well, I may not have any single reason. I may have a host of reasons. I learned it in school. Maybe you did boil water or something in chemistry once. So, okay, so you've got that. But then ask yourself, what belief does that justify? I mean, water boils at 100 degrees. Okay. What belief does that then support? If Descartes is correct, every belief except for one has to be arranged like bricks in a building. And if there's no brick over here, they all have to be lined up. And the problem is our knowledge just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. How do I know my parents are my parents? I just do. They've always been my parents. I've never really questioned it. I mean, maybe when I was a kid I thought I was adopted, but I never really needed to justify whether these were my parents. And so a lot of our knowledge is like that. It just sort of comes to us, right? And you notice that maybe a little bit whenever we went through the chapter on philosophy of religion, that there are just certain beliefs that we're raised with and we've always held them. They may be supported, they may not be supported in a very strict sense, right? It may be that I don't have any pure justification for maybe a series of claims about sacred scripture I've grown up reading. But I have other beliefs that relate to that. Maybe I have a religious figure in my life or a leader who has studied those scripts for years and is willing to testify to their accuracy or something like that. You see, it's not like bricks in a building there. It's more like a web of beliefs, and they all sort of interact. Okay, that is just our very, very brief intro to epistemology. Let's just review real quick. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's important because knowledge pervades virtually every facet of our lives, religiously, economically, even whether or not there's an afterlife, right? Notable example would be the ADE 651, for which the Iraqi government spent $85 million, which may mean that we spent $85 million on it. I don't know. I haven't gone that far into the research. But again here, nobody took the time to figure out whether or not this particular mechanism actually worked. Nobody justified the belief that this is a bomb detector, and so they never knew it. And as a result, by the way, the maker of that particular device has since been put to jail. I believe he's serving time in the United Kingdom. Then we wondered where knowledge comes from. Two places. It comes from experience, or it comes from our minds. If it comes from experience, we just think of the mind as an empty slate. If it comes from our mind, we have a very specific view of what knowledge is. It's usually logic, it's usually math. What knowledge is? It's three things. It's true, it's justified, and it's belief. If you don't have any one of those things, you don't have knowledge. Remember, it's got to be true in order to believe it. You can't believe that you can't know that Professor Vitt is a millionaire. He's not. It's got to be justified. You have to actually have reasons for thinking what you do, and those reasons have to reach a certain level. And then lastly, you have to believe it. Okay. Rounding out, we had two forms of justification. So this right here, the bricks turn into two things, right? They turn into foundationalism, which says that a belief is justified if it all rests on a single undoubtable thing, or a belief is justified if it's justified by a series of beliefs, a web of beliefs through which everything hangs. Okay, you guys, that does it for epistemology. I hope that's a helpful introduction. Look forward to having you guys read the chapter.